Please take your seats. We will begin. C'est rouge là.
Os rogaríamos que os sentaran.
No, on n'attend pas.
Vamos a empezar. People here are not used to stuff on the block.
Yeah.
So it's like 9:30, it's 7. As you may see.
Yes, I see.
Por favor.
Non, ça ne marche pas.
Voilà.
Elle a dit que maintenant ça devrait marcher.
Hola.
Bon, elle l'a pas fait. Ouais, oui. Oui. Merci.
Can we start? Go on.
We are fine, Raquel is fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sí.
No. Do we have to switch it on from there?
It's on.
It's on. I have the great pleasure to introduce Jenny Baker, the national president, as they call here, we call General Secretary of the English section. Jenny became a member in 1981.
Tenemos el placer de presentaros a la presidenta de la sección inglesa, Jenny Baker, que se hizo miembro en 1981.
She has been very active in the section since beginning.
Ha estado siempre muy activa en la sección desde el principio.
She has been part of several committees, and for the past 12 years she has also been the director of English summer schools.
Durante los últimos 12 años ha tenido siempre cargos de responsabilidad dentro de la sección y especialmente para la preparación de las escuelas de verano.
And so since 2015 she is now General Secretary of the English section.
Desde 2015 es secretaria general de la sección.
Okay, so please, Jenny.
Bueno, me ha pedido que os diga dos palabras antes de que ella empiece. Jenny va a hablar sobre la joya suprema de sabiduría. Ha escogido como base de su charla este texto antiguo conocido como la joya suprema de sabiduría porque es el que establece las necesidades o los requerimientos que un alma individual necesita en su viaje o en su camino hacia la realidad de la conciencia universal. Está muy contenta de que muchos de los puntos, bueno, sí, de que muchos de los puntos de su charla se hagan eco de otros puntos que ya se han mencionado en charlas anteriores.
Jenny Baker.
Si tengo que traducir. Ah, no. No, qué bien.
Good morning, everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be here and a great honour to address you at this European Federation Congress. I have chosen to base my talk on the ancient text known as the CREST Jewel of Wisdom, as it sets out the requirements that an individual soul needs on their journey towards the reality of universal consciousness. I am pleased that many of the points in my talk echo those already made by previous speakers. So my talk is titled The CREST Jewel of Wisdom. The CREST Jewel of Wisdom is, along with the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, one of the ancient sacred texts that has guided many along their spiritual path for centuries. The CREST Jewel of Wisdom is the English translation of the Sanskrit words Viveka Chudamani. The date and the authorship of this book are unknown, but it is generally accepted to be the work of Sri Adi Shankaracharya. Who was Shankaracharya? Esoteric Buddhism believes that about 50 years after his death, the Gautama Buddha, having refused full Dharmakaya and Nirvana, and for the purposes of karma and philanthropy, was reborn as Shankaracharya, the greatest Vedantic teacher in India. It is stated that Shankaracharya simply was Buddha in all respects in a new body. HPB says in her book, The Mystery of Buddha, while the expression in its mystic sense is true, the way of putting it may be misleading until explained. Shankaracharya was a Buddha, most assuredly, but he never was a reincarnation of the Buddha. Although Gautama's astral ego, or rather his bodhisattva, may have been associated in some mysterious way with Shankaracharya. Yes, she said, it was perhaps the ego Gautama under a new and better adapted casket, that of a Brahmin of southern India. However, on grounds of style and terminology, it is thought today to have been composed by some outstanding Advaitic author who lived some centuries after the great Shankaracharya of the commentaries, possibly in the late 10th century. Now, the word viveka comes from the Sanskrit word vic, meaning to sift, and is usually translated as spiritual discrimination. And the word Chudamani means crest jewel. Where is and what do we mean by crest jewel? According to Raghavan Iyer, it is the crest above the forehead of the human body, the regal gem of pure discernment and spiritual wakefulness. In this talk, we will be examining the meanings of several important words and phrases, and we begin with the word discernment. The word discernment, according to the dictionary, means good judgment and insight. The book is set out, as many Eastern sacred texts, as a dialogue between a guru and a disciple. The purpose of the writings is to set out for the disciple instructions on how to achieve enlightenment. The topics covered include how to overcome the obstacles that will inevitably be encountered along the way, how to discriminate between the unreal and the real. Also, instructions on meditation and Vedantic philosophy, such as the Gunas, which are tamas, rajas, and sattvic, the three constituents of nature, the panchakoshas, the 5 sheaths of existence, and the 3 states of consciousness, waking, the dreaming, and the dreamless state. Shankaracharya sets us thinking right from the start, as in the 2nd verse he stresses the difficulty of obtaining self-realization. And I quote, "It is hard for living creatures to attain human birth, harder still to become a man, harder still to become a Brahman, harder still to be devoted to the spiritual path of the Vedas, harder still to acquire learning in that domain. But to effect a complete discrimination of the self from the not-self, and to have direct experience of one's true nature and liberation in the form of establishment in the self as the absolute, that is not attained without the good deeds of many millions of lives." End of the quote. So, self-realization possibly takes millions of lifetimes and is a hard path for the aspirant to tread. So how can it be achieved? We are told that it is by learning to distinguish between self and not self, and by gaining the wisdom of discrimination. How do we recognize the difference between the self and the not self? Verse 2 in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita states, and I quote, "Know that I am the knower of all the fields of my creation, and that the wisdom which sees the field and the knower of the field is true wisdom." In the technical language of Indian philosophy, the human body is called the field because the fruits of actions, in other words, karma, are reaped therein. So the knower of the field, in other words, man's spirit, is separate from it. This verse then means that God is all-knowing, and that knowledge of the field and the knower of the field, of the man and his real self, is the true knowledge of metaphysics. For liberation and for the freedom from suffering and bondage, man needs to be able to identify the individual self with the cosmic self. When the state of liberation has been achieved in one's life on earth, it is called Jivan Mukti. How do we achieve liberation? Shankaracharya tells us it is by prayer, devotion, compassion, performing good deeds, and by leading others along the right path. However, these attributes alone are not enough, for it is also necessary to have the guidance of a teacher who has achieved enlightenment. So the first step along the road to enlightenment is to ask oneself certain questions, such as, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of life? What am I doing with my life? When we have a satisfactory answer to these questions and similar ones, we will experience compassion, freedom, happiness, and wisdom. So what do we mean by freedom? It means being masters of our minds, masters of immortality, having overcome death through the practices of charity, duty, and prayer, and by knowing the truth of the real. Knowledge of the truth. How do we obtain this knowledge? Shankaracharya tells us that it is by overcoming desires for the pleasures of the senses and by becoming indifferent to any gain or reward resulting from our actions. He says it is not only by performing many deeds, however meritorious they may be, but by introspective reflection that we reach the truth. It is the mind which plays a significant part in the search for truth, because the mind can be both an aid as well as a hindrance to us. Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutras, talks about the fluctuations of the mind and the importance of calming the mind by yoga practices. We can think of the mind like an ocean, which is always in motion on the surface, sometimes angry and violent, as in a storm, and sometimes calmer, when just a gentle breeze causes ripples to disturb the surface. Yet beneath the surface, the ocean is still, and it is in the depths of the ocean that the mind discovers profound wisdom. So, how can we calm the mind to reach the depths of wisdom? Shankaracharya tells us it is by the practices of desirelessness, devotion, and compassion, and by meditating on one's true self. It requires self-study and a deep conviction in the oneness of all life, and that the spiritual truth will never change. In verse 13, Shankaracharya warns that the knowledge of reality does not come only through rituals, such as bathing in sacred places or being charitable, nor by practicing breathing techniques, but by meditation and with the guidance of a teacher who has the knowledge one seeks. So, what are the attributes necessary for the knowledge of truth? The first is discrimination, and in Sanskrit this is viveka. In the spiritual sense, this means being able to discriminate between the unreal and the real. These days, the word discrimination can and does have political and unpleasant overtones. The dictionary has 4 different definitions of the word discrimination. The first, and presumably the most commonly used, is unfavourable treatment based on prejudice, especially regarding race, age, or sex. I feel that sadly, this is how many people think of the word today. However, the word does have positive definitions as well as the negative one. And the second definition of discrimination is good taste or judgment in an artistic matter. And the third is the power of discriminating or observing differences. And the last is a distinction made with the mind or in action. We can discriminate on several levels, by our actions, by our thoughts, and with our emotions. We can be overcritical, unnecessarily judgmental, and we can be prejudiced in many aspects of our lives. This is not the discrimination we are talking about. We must forget all negative meanings of the word and concentrate on the positive aspects. We are talking about being able to distinguish between what in this life is everlasting and what is not. We will eventually come to realize that everything in this world has a beginning and an ending and is therefore considered finite. Anything that dies cannot be thought of as real and having permanence. Only that which never dies can be real. Discrimination means that we should always be vigilant, so we get to know what is passing and what is eternal, and then to ignore the former and cling to the latter with all the strength of the soul. The second attribute required for the knowledge of truth is detachment. The Sanskrit word for this is vairagya, and it means becoming detached from the enjoyment of all rewards in this life and in those lives to come. It means allowing ourselves to be unaffected by and indifferent to the pleasures of life. We need our five senses to be able to acknowledge our existence, for without them we could not function. I'm not saying that we cannot get enjoyment in our lives, but living only for the desires of life's pleasures brings us neither happiness nor spiritual contentment. Our aim in life should be to know the reality of the oneness of all things by letting go of all material desires and attachments. And in verse 375 of the Viveka-Chudamani, it says this: O wise one, know that detachment and metaphysical understanding are the two wings of the soul, whereby it soars upwards like a bird. It cannot alight on the pinnacle of liberation by the use of only one wing without the other. End of the quote. Detachment means that you have the power to extricate yourself from any object, any experience in the world, however sweet it may be, at a moment's notice. The reward for detachment is knowledge of the true self and the peace and bliss that this brings. The next attribute is devotion. Shankaracharya defines devotion as the investigation of one's true nature, or as some put it, the investigation of the true nature of the self. How do we investigate our true nature, our self? By devoting ourselves to spiritual practices such as meditation, by compassion, and by following a guru or someone who has found their own self and is prepared to guide others along the path to enlightenment. Devotion to a spiritual ideal dispels the darkness and gloom of narrow self-love. It is the way out of the web of karma into the light of pure consciousness and freedom from bondage. There are other things which are required for the knowledge of truth, and these are, I will list them. Number one, inner control. This means constantly fixing one's mind on the goal by keeping calm and creating a tranquil mind in all circumstances. And number two, outer control, known as Dharma, D-A-M-A. And this is described as using ourselves humbly as servants of others and by using our talents positively for the good of humanity. Number three, withdrawal of the mind from external objects, and this is called uparati, and concentrating on peace and bliss. Number 4 is endurance, also known as titiksha. And this is described as the ability to create indifference to the pairs of opposites, such as pain and pleasure, and by doing so without complaining or becoming anxious. This requires forbearance and tolerance. And all these should be accompanied by a faith in the teachings of the sacred scriptures, and by continually fixing one's mind on the absolute. I have another question. What is the mind? I'm not the first one to be talking about the mind this week. The mind can be thought of as the connection between the body and the soul. The mind has a dual nature. It can be our friend and play its part in the liberation of the soul, but it can also act as our enemy and maintain attachment to the physical body. How do we release ourselves from bondage? How do we find the truth? The first thing we need to do is to discard all likes and dislikes. The next is to pursue detachment and discrimination with heart and soul. Shankaracharya talks about having a pure mind, which is sattvic in nature, while an impure mind, he says, is governed by tamas and rajas. When the light of the soul shines through a pure and unsullied mind, it is untainted and radiant. However, an impure mind dulls the soul's light and prevents it from shining. So, how do we purify the mind? The first thing to do is to allow the mind to become still and tranquil. We need to be resolute and courageous and to harbour only spiritual desires. And we need to continually practice discrimination and detachment. We are reminded that the chief medium through which the divine life expresses itself is the mind, and that as the mind is, so is life. If the mind is impure, thoughts are impure, and actions are confused. An impure mind is full of desires, and the chief function of the mind is to fulfill these desires. Even some good desires may produce disharmony. All desires are such are impediments to freedom. And in verse 37 of the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna has this to say: greedy desire and wrath born of passion are the great evils, the sum of destruction, and the great enemy of the soul. The spiritual life begins with subduing harmful lower desires prompted by either passion, which we could call rajas, or lethargy, in other words tamas, and by promoting goodness and higher sattvic desires. Sattva, tamas and rajas are the 3 constituents of nature. Everything in life, from the smallest to the biggest, from the humblest to the grandest, contains these 3 in varying degrees. The human being is included in this. Tamas is often described as inertia or laziness. Rajas is the opposite of tamas, being considered as activity or passion, whereas sattva is the in-between state of reflection and tranquility. The sattvic state should predominate our lives, as this leads to a quietening of our minds. We should discard thoughts that inhibit our powers of discrimination and detachment. The things that we should try to avoid are disharmony anger, impatience, superiority, and desire for worldly pleasures. The things we should acquire are nurture and loving kindness, humility, contentment, selflessness, and a desire for the truth. There must be a yearning for freedom which will conquest the love of our senses. We must also have faith in the sacred scriptures, and we must put into practice their teachings. Reading about and listening to sacred texts is only the start of spiritual inquiry, for then we must put all our spiritual ideals into practice. To stop the infatuation with the senses, we should treat them like poison, and instead concentrate on the contentment derived from spiritual sources, which will lead to joy, compassion, honesty, peace, and self-control. Our bodies are only a temporary vehicle for our souls, so learning to be detached from them is the beginning of the path of liberation and freedom from the wheel of death and rebirth. The danger of being obsessed with our physical image, our power or prestige, or possessions is that such obsessions hide our true nature. So by not becoming a slave to our body or to our senses and emotions is the start of our journey to freedom. Sadly, today's Western culture, and also some Eastern cultures as well, pays much attention to fashion and fame. I feel that the latest craze of taking selfies all the time, anywhere and everywhere, only enhances our self-images. And apologies for anybody who likes taking selfies. I think that we are in danger of becoming a vain, proud, boastful, and self-loving society. I'm not saying that we should not care for and nurture our bodies, for it is important that we do all we can to keep ourselves healthy and fit. All we need to do is to realize that our inner life is more important, as it is the part of us that does not perish. I have another question. What is truth? This is a big question when one thinks about it. I would like to refer you to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and particularly to the first part of his eightfold path. The first limb, as it is called, consists of the 5 yamas, or self-restraints, one of which is satya, or non-lying. And the other 4, for your information, are non-violence, non-stealing, non-sensuality, and non-acquisitiveness. Perhaps better expressed in a positive way as harmlessness, truthfulness, honesty, temperance, and freedom from greed. And it is said that if one of these is practiced earnestly, then the rest will follow naturally. How many phrases in the English language contain the word true or truth? And here is just 2. The first, being true to oneself. And the second, telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Not doing this in a court of law is an act of perjury and could lead to a prison sentence. However, the mind can play tricks on us and will let us think something is true when it is not. We can be so programmed that we preempt events and see what we want to see and not what really happened. So we must not trust our minds to lead us to the truth. But if that is the case, how will we ever know the truth? Surely it is by reasoning and logic that we make sense of the world around us. Of course it is. But to know the real truth, we must go deeper into the mind by practicing stillness and meditation. Do we always tell the truth? I would say that we would consider ourselves to be truthful people and not intentionally speak otherwise. However, we must be ever watchful that we do not unintentionally pass on gossip and spread rumours. We must also be careful not to be judgmental and overcritical in our dealings with others. The motto of our society is, "There is no religion higher than truth." And more correctly, it should read, "There is no dharma higher than truth." So let us make our lives truthful, be honest and straightforward and open, and do not pretend to be other than who we really are. In other words, be true to yourself. I see the life of a theosophist as one of service to others in whatever way is appropriate. We all have different things to give and different ways of doing this. But none of us should think themselves to be superior or better than anyone else. And if prestige or power should come to us, then we should adopt a demeanour of indifference to these things and carry on doing our duty to others. Being generous with our time and energy will bring its own rewards. All this is being true to ourselves. Knowing who we really are, we do not pretend to be anything but a servant of our higher self. We are a spiritual entity temporarily in a physical body that needs to be cared for but not worshipped. Being true to oneself means acknowledging the existence of the true self, that divine essence, that spark of divinity contained within us all. The purpose of a body and life on earth is to enable the soul to progress to perfection. What stops us gaining perfection? The inability to discriminate between the unreal and the real. Something we call Maya gets in the way of our endeavours to reach perfection in this life. Eastern philosophy states that the Absolute alone exists and there is no variation or plurality, no sin or vice in him. However, there is a principle which is responsible for the phenomenal limitations and conditions and that principle we call Maya. The whole world is the product of Maya. And another word for it, as I'm sure you know, is illusion. Often a difficult concept to grasp by our rather limited minds. Shankaracharya says that Maya consists of the three Gunas, which I've already said are the constituents of nature or states of being. I'll just repeat them. Sattva is equilibrium, Rajas motion, and Tamas rest. And it is said that Maya cannot be perceived, only inferred by humility and true inquiry. Time and space are factors of Maya, as is the law of cause and effect. Maya can only be dissolved by the knowledge of the Absolute, of truth. Another question, what is the nature of the self? And this is self with a capital S. The self is the true being, which is eternal and whose nature is bliss. Bliss is to self as heat is to fire and cold is to ice. Only someone who has been freed from the bondage of the not-self can know the bliss of the Lord. which we know as Atman. The Atman is not born, nor does it die. It does not grow, or shrink, or change in any way. It is pure consciousness. It is immortal and cannot be modified. It is the essence of infinite bliss. How do we discover our true nature? And it really comes down to the control of the mind in 3 ways. Notice we come back to the mind time and time again. And these 3 ways are, number 1, by avoiding anything vulgar which goes against the laws of truth and divine love. Number 2, by regulating our desires by sattvic practices. And number 3, by purifying our intellect and aspiring to divinity. We must learn to discriminate between the self and the not self if we want to end the continual cycle of death and rebirth. We must strive to expand our consciousness to the level of our higher self, whilst still in this rather mundane world of ours. Only then a person can know his or her true nature as existence, which in Sanskrit is Sat, consciousness, in other words, Chit, and bliss, Ananda. Sat, Chit, Ananda. Shankaracharya expounds on the Vedantic philosophy of the 5 sheaths, or in Sanskrit, the Panchakoshas. And the first of these is the Manomaya Kosha, or the food sheath. It exists only by the food we eat. It is unstable, ever-changing, and, as we know, will eventually die. Therefore, it cannot be thought of as one's true self, the supreme reality. So we must abstain from identifying ourselves with the food sheath. The next sheath is the Pranamaya Kosha, or the vital energy sheath. It enables the physical body to move and act. This is also not the true self, as it is in constant motion, just like the oceans and the winds. And the third sheath is Manomaya Kosha. This is our thinking principle, which contains the 5 sense organs of perception. It is responsible for the production of our joys and our sorrows. It is the creator of the dream world, and can both create and destroy obstructions on the way to self-realization. Manomaya Kosha can also be thought of as the lower mind, and is an object of the inner consciousness, and so is not the real self. The next sheath is the Vijnanamaya Kosha, or the sheath of the higher mind, and it consists of the higher mind itself, with its modifications along with the sense organs and their modifications. It is the performer of action and the cause of the soul's reincarnation. And it can also be called the knowledge sheath, the intellect, or the buddhi. And it is through desires and actions that the soul comes and goes in a variety of bodies, and it is through the knowledge sheath that the individual soul experiences grief and joy, pleasure and pain. And the 3 states of consciousness belong to this sheath. I will just remind you what these 3 states of consciousness are. These are 1, the waking state, which is, I hope, what you're in at the moment. Number 2, the dreaming state. And number 3, the dreamless state. The higher mind identifies itself with the duties, rituals, and attributes associated with the various stages of life. Because of its extreme proximity to the highest self, the Manomaya Kosha is highly luminous. And the fifth sheath is called Anandamaya Kosha, or the Sheath of Bliss. It manifests mostly in dreamless sleep. Behind it is the innermost principle of all beings, Brahman, in its complete integrity. Now, the sheath bliss is not the supreme self, as it is based on conditions and it is a modification of nature. We must go beyond the bliss consciousness in dreamless sleep to discover our true self, which is the source of unconditioned joy. In the Vivekachudamani, the disciple asks his guru this question. When the 5 sheaths have been rejected as unreal, I see nothing left over but the non-existence of all. What noble reality remains with which the knower of self can identify? And the guru replied, "Your question is excellent. You are good at reasoning. You must perceive by the most subtle thinking that the principle by which all your different states are experienced, but which is itself not an object of experience, is the self, the ultimate knower." In other words, we must understand that man has 2 different selves, one called the empirical self and the other the transcendental self. The former is mortal, ever-changing and unreliable. Truth can only be realized by the transcendental self. We must not look at our reflection in a mirror and think that is who we really are, as it is only a reflection. Instead, we must learn to identify ourselves with the transcendental self, the divinity within, which cannot be seen by looking in a mirror. When we have become aware of our own true self as eternal and all-pervading, and when the empirical self is silenced, then we are free from evil and bondage. Then we are a divine ray, and like a lamp whose radiance shines out to others. The enlightened being who has realized the Absolute does not return again for reincarnation in this world. Yet another question for you. What is the nature of the Absolute? And I'm going to quote a few verses. So verses 239 to 242 say this. Therefore, the Supreme Brahman is the one reality without a second. It is pure wisdom, the stainless one, absolute peace without beginning and without end, void of action and the essence of ceaseless bliss. When all the differences created by Maya have been rejected, there remains a self-illumined something which is eternal, fixed without stain, immeasurable, without form, unmanifested, without name, indestructible. The wise know that the supreme truth is absolute consciousness, in which are united the knower, the known, and the knowledge, and is infinite and unchangeable. Brahman is the infinite, eternal, all-pervading light. It can be neither taken hold of nor abandoned. Inconceivable by the mind and inexpressible by speech, immeasurable, without beginning, without end. That's the end of the quotation, which was translated by Mohini M. Chatterjee. How can we realize the absolute? The answer, by meditating on the fact that we are fundamentally that which never dies, and that nothing but pure being exists. Verse 255 says, "You are that absolute which is above caste, code of conduct, family and tribe, which is without name or form, without virtues or defects, which transcends space, time, and objects. Meditate on this in your mind." Verse 259 says, "You are that absolute which is indestructible, free from birth, growth, development, decay, disease, and death. Meditate on this in your mind." Verse 260 says this, "You are that absolute which has no distinction, whose essential nature remains ever unchanged, which is motionless like a waveless ocean, which is ever free, which is incapable of undergoing division. Meditate on this in your mind." Verse 263 says, "You are that absolute which is real, but which appears in different forms due to error, undergoing apparent modification as name, form, and attribute, while being in its true nature ever without modification, like gold. Meditate on this in your mind." And lastly, verse 264 says this, "You are that absolute which shines with nothing beyond, which is identical with the self, which is reality, consciousness, joy, and indestructible. Meditate on this in your mind." By meditating on these statements, doubts and difficulties will disappear, and you will see the teachings clearly. Separate the self from the non-self and the realm of sense objects, and then remain true to that self. Identify yourself with that which dwells in the cave of the heart. The self lies hidden by impressions of the not-self, and when these impressions have been destroyed, the true self manifests clearly on its own accord. We are warned to be ever watchful and not careless or casual. To concentrate continuously on the absolute and the self by saying, "This I am." How do we concentrate on the self? We can do this by letting go of the body and the sense objects. We must keep to the spiritual path and not become sidetracked by the pursuit of pleasure or power, which will ultimately lead to pain and suffering and other hardships. We must apply discipline and virtue to our daily life and let go of prejudices, vanity, anger, and avarice. For the seeker of the real, the aim is to be able to contemplate the divine with a pure heart, a heart from which all desires have been eliminated. A person who practices concentration and is able to dissolve everything external, including the mind, senses, and ego, into the self as pure consciousness, is freed from the bonds of worldly reincarnation. As I have already said, this state is not reached only by the study of books, but by discrimination, detachment, devotion, and discernment. And the result is ananda or bliss, an imperishable, all-pervasive consciousness. It cannot be expressed by the mind apart from the use of symbols. And the highest expression, as I have already said, is Sat Chit Ananda. The results of following the disciplines of meditation and devotion are the emergence of a higher faculty of knowledge, buddhi, and communion with the Absolute, the All-Highest, and then to absorption of the individuality. The great realization of the Absolute consciousness as the Self takes place not in the mind through logic or reason, but by connecting with the ever-present, often hidden center of our being, that divine spark which shines from within. A seeker of truth has only to look within for eternal bliss and liberation from the unreality of our material world. Therefore, be strong in the conviction that the true self is there to be discovered, and let go of personality and the pleasures of life on earth. The mark of someone who is liberated in this life and has realized the CREST jewel of wisdom is that they have no sense of I or mine regarding the physical body. They do not remember the past with nostalgia or take any special thought of the future, and they receive whatever comes at the present moment with indifference. The mark of one liberated in life is that he or she sees the oneness in all and sees his self and the Absolute as one. So, what are the characteristics of a spiritual practitioner? And I will list 6 of them, though I'm sure there are probably more. Number 1, the personality radiates harmony, love, and peace. Number 2, they have a serene demeanor. Number 3, they have a great sense of justice and compassion. Number 4, the pairs of opposites, such as success or failure, pain or pleasure, no longer hold their power. Number 5, theory and practice have become one, as to know wisdom is to live a life of wisdom. And number 6, their motives are selfless and pure and all-inclusive. I will quote from verse 568, which says this: "When such a disciplined soul attains at death the nature of the Absolute as pure, undifferentiated being, total transcendence without even the appearance of a body, he does not return for reincarnation." So, in conclusion, we have discovered that viveka means spiritual discernment, and that chudamani means crest jewel, is the crest above the human forehead. We have learned 4 key words: discernment, discrimination, detachment, and devotion. We have also learned that maya, or illusion, is an element that enters all finite things, for everything that exists has only a relative, not absolute reality. We have discovered that the true reality is not what we can discern using the faculties of the senses and the logical mind, as the crest jewel implies, the truth lies above and beyond the mind. If the Absolute is beyond human comprehension, how are we expected to be able to recognize it in this material world, which is the only one we know? Paradoxically, It is by using logic and reasoning that we conclude we have to reach out beyond all known things, and in spite of appearances, accept that the world we inhabit cannot be true reality, as it will eventually perish, as does our human body. But there is something that never dies and never changes, the one that was, is, and ever will be. By using our inner strength, by perseverance, and by stilling the mind, and by gazing beyond appearances towards the infinite, we can achieve our goal. Reality encompasses and transcends all time and space, and within it there is no difference between one who knows and what is known. Reality is infinite, eternal, non-dual consciousness. Thank you very much for listening to me.